Okay, welcome back. Sorry about that. Had a little interruption. So, the Yalta Conference was held before the war was over. And then the Potsdam Conference is held after victory in Europe. Now, we've got a president change now, right? So it's Harry Truman who's going to be there. And Clement Attlee, who is from Britain, because Churchill stepped down. They meet with Joseph Stalin to decide kind of what's going to happen. And so we'd already decided Germany was going to be divided, but how is it going to happen? So Germany's divided into 4 zones. The U.S. Still wants to be able to have access to the markets in Europe, and the Soviets want control in Eastern Europe. He promises, remember, free elections. What does it say here? Do you think he would keep his word? Of course not. Free elections do not happen. Remember, pause until everyone is ready to go to the next slide. So this Iron Curtain comes from a statement from Winston Churchill. So Churchill is no longer prime minister, and he begins traveling around the U.S. where he's extremely popular. My mom says that she still remembers reading a book about him when she was in high school, and so that was in the 60s. So he says that an Iron Curtain has been drawn across Europe. So let's actually look at this speech here.
In the spring of 1946, Winston Churchill traveled to the United States. He tried to shock Americans out of their complacency. In a speech at Fulton, Missouri, carried on radio, he warned them how the Soviets were acting in Europe.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Budapest. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere.
Churchill's vivid picture of a continent divided by an iron curtain helped change the public mood. Once, the press had portrayed an alliance of 3 equals. Now, Uncle Joe was turned into a scheming despot, forcing whole countries into submission. From the East, Soviet cartoonists responded in kind. These crude caricatures were part of a new type of war, in which governments taught whole populations to demonize the other. An American newsreel caught the new tone.
In the background was the growing struggle between 2 great powers to shape the post-war world. Soviet Russia was expansively stabbing westward, knifing into nations left empty by war. On orders from the Kremlin, Russia had launched one of history's most drastic political, moral, and economic wars, a Cold War. The United States was obliged to help Europe safeguard its traditional freedoms and the independence of its nation. Gone was the spirit of wartime unity that reached its peak on that historic afternoon in April 45 at the Elbe River in Germany. Here, 2 worlds actually met, but this coalition was to be torn asunder.
The Soviets also recalled the meeting on the Elbe. But their version showed a bloodthirsty American general bent on the domination of Europe.
Старая война окончилась. Началась новая. Война с коммунизмом. Я вижу другие сны, господин генерал. Мне снится мир. Пожалуйста. У нас свобода сновидений.
So what we see, guys, is how propaganda is really going to be used to influence people by both sides, you know, kind of in that negative view of the Soviets are portraying of Americans, and Americans did the same thing. So here you can see kind of this iron curtain. So the white countries are the neutral nations, and you guys are going to get an opportunity to do a Cold War map like this a little bit later. So NATO was started by the United States and Britain and France, and it stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and then Warsaw Pact was started by the Soviet Union. But you can see this division. This is the Soviet Republic of Yugoslavia, and so it's a communist country, but it's not part of the Soviet Union. And Poland and Finland are going to be taken soon by the Soviets. So President Truman and the policy of containment. So what do you think President Truman is trying to contain? What is he trying to keep in? Communism, obviously. He's trying to stop the spread of communism. And so they developed this policy to do whatever they could to try to prevent communism spreading to other countries. So the Truman Doctrine is also what this is called, because it's named after him. And under the Truman Doctrine, he wanted to stop communism from spreading, and he thought that countries that were weak would be more susceptible to communism. So under the Truman Doctrine, which is part of this Marshall Plan, they started giving monies to countries. So the Truman Doctrine, they give $400 million to Greece and Turkey to stop communism from spreading there. And it works. The communists don't take over in those countries. The Marshall Plan, it's the same kind of idea. We've got to help rebuild Europe. So the Marshall Plan proposed to give money to European countries. Now, it's important to understand that we offered this to both the Soviet Union as well, but the Soviet Union refused. We gave $13 billion. Now, why do you think the Soviet Union wouldn't want our help? The reason is they're afraid that there are strings attached, that if we gave them aid, then we would want them to be democratic. Now, we didn't require anything of any country, but you can understand why they would have thought that. And even today, there's still Eastern Europe is trying to grow. Their economies aren't as good as Western Europe. Okay, guys, so now we're going to look in your notes. We're going to start talking about events, specific events. So remember that Germany is going to be divided. So what happens is Berlin, remember, is inside of East Germany. And Stalin wants the Allies to give up West Berlin. So he closes off so they can't get to it. He blockades. And Truman's like, we're not going to give up Berlin. So Truman, for almost a year, 327 days, we sent supplies. Planes would go off and they would drop supplies off to the West Berliners. So you can see here this propaganda. So your blank is the Berlin blockade. And so milk, the new weapon of democracy, this idea that the planes were dropping off these supplies. And the Soviets don't know what to do. They think we'll eventually give up. Well, you know us. We're not likely to give up. So this Berlin airlift happens. So you can see on the map here. All right, so this is the city of Berlin. Berlin is divided. So this is East Germany that the Soviets control. This is West Germany that Britain, France, and America are doing together. And then the city itself was divided. So you can see the planes would come in and they come back out, but they had to come in to give supplies to West Berlin because it wasn't. It was blockaded. They wouldn't let us drive in. So here's a little bit about the Berlin airlift.
Hey guys, welcome to a little bit of hip Hughes history in my classroom of learning. We're going to bang out Berlin airlift in the next few minutes. Basic understandings, guys. This isn't a scholarly lecture. This is so you can walk around and not look like an idiot, and definitely pass your exams. So check it out. 1948, 1949, Berlin blockade, Berlin airlift. Whoop, whoop. All right, you want to definitely start off with the idea that the American foreign policy following World War II is called containment. See that? That we can't destroy communism, but we certainly are going to stop it from spreading. And really the Berlin Blockade and the Berlin Airlift is the first major episode of containment that's not just purely economic in nature. Following World War II, the United States adopted something called the Marshall Plan, where basically we're going to bail out Western Europe, including the area that we're controlling in Western Germany, in order to, in a sense, make communism less attractive, to make sure that those societies are going to bounce back really quick. And of course, Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, sees this more as kind of a play for American influence. That the Marshall Plan is trying to expand American influence into Europe. He's threatened by that. So really, the Berlin Blockade is a response to that pressure. So I never understood this till I was an adult, so I'll just say it out loud. Berlin's in East Germany. And even though it's not East Germany yet, it's going to be real soon. Germany was actually divided into 4 sectors following World War II. The one sector in the east is under Soviet control, and then the other sectors in the west are really Western powers, NATO, allies of the United States, and the U.S. controlling that. But Berlin, baby's on the other side. Berlin's in Soviet influence. But the United States and the Allies have half of that city under their control, West Berlin. So what does Stalin do? He blockades Berlin. He's going to shut down the roads, or at least make it so if you're trading, you're not going to be able to use those roads to trade goods. And after only a week or so, Berlin is losing electricity. The people are getting kind of hungry. They're running out of medical supplies. And Stalin really sees the West kind of going to be with their tail between their legs leaving Berlin. And I don't even think before this episode that Harry Truman thought that really maybe we would even stay in Berlin. But if we feel as though that Stalin is trying to expand his influence by blockading West Berlin to get to Berlin, then we have to stop the spread of that. Because our policy, baby, is containment. Containment. So that's what we're going to do. And the Berlin Airlift is what ensues. So the Berlin Airlift is an episode of containment to save West Berlin from communist infiltration, from communist expansion. So what exactly is it? From June 1948 to May 1949, the United States and the allies of the United States, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, other countries, are going to fly roughly 500 flights a day, maybe 5,000 tons a day for a full year practically, over West Berlin, dropping supplies in. It ends up being over almost 250,000 flights, about 200,000 flights. And actually, by the end of the airlift, they were actually importing more goods into West Berlin than they were on the roads before the airlift. And I think that it's egg on the Soviet Union face, that Stalin really envisioned a Germany under Soviet control, and certainly the city of Berlin under Soviet control. That ain't going to happen, baby. The United States and the allies of the United States are going to secure West Berlin through that airlift, and they're going to stop the spread of communism. And eventually the Soviets are going to build a wall in Berlin on the East German side, right, to make sure that West Berlin is not going to influence East Germany or East Berlin, and the people of East Berlin are not going to seek refuge in West Berlin. But there you go, baby. That wall's going to stay up to 1989, but you get the major idea that the Berlin Airlift is a response to the Berlin Blockade, which is an example, say it with me, it's containment. So there you go, guys. We'll see you next time when you do a little bit of learning on the Hip Hughes History Channel. And we're here.
All right, so the Berlin Airlift, again, really kind of we've hit over this, and this makes Stalin not very happy. So we've officially now got 2 sides, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So what's going to go there, it says versus the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw Pact is going to be on your line there. And that's the military alliance that was formed by the Soviet Union. So these are the 2 sides. You're going to be labeling these and coloring these in on your map later today. So the Korean War is the first kind of big conflict that we see. It's the first real test of the United Nations. And the Korean War is really just kind of war of several firsts. It's the first real test of the UN. It's the first time that we see an integrated American army. It's the first time that helicopters are used for military evacuation. MASH units, you guys ever watch TV show MASH? My dad loves it. That's set during the Korean War. Also first air-to-air jet combat. So here's basically what happened. So we've got North Korea and South Korea, which was divided at the end of World War II. Because remember, Japan had taken over Korea. So they divided it up. And it would be divided at here, the 38th parallel. So Soviet Union gets the North Korea, and we get South Korea. You can imagine we seem to be a very big fan of dividing things up at the end of World War II. So what happens is so America's here, we pull out, we leave, and North Korea invades South Korea. And then we bring our forces back and we push them back up here. Then we decide to push them all the way to the Chinese border, and China doesn't like that. They decide to push back. Russia is supplying North Korea. Guess what happens at the end of the war? Nothing. Nothing changed at all. We're exactly back at the end. So South Korea remains democratic, and North Korea remains communist. And of course we know North Korea, Kim Jong-il has just bad guy. But it remains divided. So the United Nations, with Truman's backing, go in and they decide to help South Korea, and ultimately nothing changes. Okay, so again, we're just doing a brief introduction. We'll talk more about Korean War and Vietnam War next class. All right, so your next blank is the Berlin Wall. Berlin and the significance of the Berlin Wall. So people were escaping. They want to go to West Germany because West Germany is better than East Germany. And what we see here is, look at this. This is the numbers of people who are leaving East Germany and going to West Germany. And how they would escape is through West Berlin. Look at these numbers. If communism is so great, why are people running away? And so these numbers were very concerning. In the peak, you kind of see here in 1961, and there's a big drop-off. Stalin has a wall built to keep people in. Again, if communism is so great, why do we have to keep a wall to keep people in? So the Berlin Wall becomes an actual visual representation of this Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill had been talking about. Kennedy, he goes there, he gives this speech at the Brandenburg Gate, and he says that Ich bin ein Berliner, that I am a Berliner. It's a very famous speech. And Stalin dies, and Nikita Khrushchev is going to become the new leader of the Soviet Union, and he's unable to push out the NATO and Americans, and he continues to not look good. Which then leads us to, and I'm sorry, you're going to have to skip down. This is your next to last box. It says crisis. You're going to write in the blank Cuban Missile Crisis. So I'm doing my notes in chronological order, and I'm sorry I messed up on yours. The box beside it says, this crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Okay, so find that, fill in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So John F. Kennedy is president now. Truman is gone. We had Eisenhower, and then we had Kennedy. And so both sides, the Soviet Union and America, are both building up their weapons. We call this an arms race because they're both trying to compete. And Soviet missiles had to be closer to us. So two things happen. One, and this is a lot of times, and we don't talk about this part, we really started this, we being the United States. We put weapons in Turkey. Remember, we're good allies of Turkey. And we put weapons in Turkey, pointing them towards the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was upset about this. They asked us to remove them. We ignored them. So then they sent weapons to Cuba. Now, this really concerned us because here's Cuba. There we are. So we're talking about basically 90 kilometers, 90 miles off the, well, let's see, it's not less than 90 miles, not 90 kilometers, off the coast of Florida. And so you can see here where the ranges were. So the ballistic missiles, or the medium range, wouldn't have hit D.C., but the intermediate range would. So we were very concerned that there were missiles in Cuba. So this really is, you ever play the game chicken, like who's going to back down first? That is exactly what this is. And there is, we sent planes to kind of figure out what was going on there, and we had evidence that they had missiles there. And Cuba had become communist. They're really good friends with the Soviet Union. Fidel Castro was taken over. Again, that's partly our fault. We had a failed invasion, and then there was a coup, and we tried to help, but we didn't help well enough, and needless to say, Cuba became communist. So there's this whole idea that they're both ready to declare war. This is the closest we probably ever came to nuclear war. And finally, Khrushchev backed down, and he ordered the removal. So this is really a great political cartoon here. You know, we're both sitting on missiles. This is Khrushchev. This is Kennedy. You've got the button, like, who's going to push first? Are we going to blow them up? Or are they going to blow us up? We were eyeball to eyeball, and the other fellow just blinked. Like, really, Khrushchev backing down is what saved us from nuclear war. So during all of this, China is facing its own. So notice this kind of, we start a little bit, look at the spread of the red, and then suddenly China has taken over, has become communist. And so America sees this happening, and this scares us. We're very scared about China becoming communist. So we're back up in this box here under Berlin Wall. Division of China into two nations at the end of the Chinese Civil War. So China goes into a civil war, and they get rid of the emperor, and they try to set up a republic. And the guy who does that is a really good guy called Sun Yat-sen. But Sun Yat-sen dies, and his follower is Chiang Kai-shek. And Chiang Kai-shek just wasn't quite as strong as Sun Yat-sen. But everybody didn't necessarily want them to be a democracy. There was another guy at this time called Mao Zedong. And he's the one we really got to remember. And he's the leader of communist China. And we're going to talk more about this again next class when we have Stations Day. So there continued to be kind of this conflict between, if you will, between two Chinas, the nationalist China and the communist China. And eventually Mao is going to win. And we'll talk more about how Mao wins. But basically the people put their support behind Mao. And he kicks out all of the nationalists, and he's left controlling. And Mao is a really bad guy. Mao kills about 300 million Chinese, but he proclaimed it the People's Republic of China, which I like to say is an oxymoron because it's not the people's and it sure isn't a republic. The leaders of the nationalists, they escaped to the island of Taiwan, just off the coast. All right, so let's move on to the Vietnam War. So your next blank, it's the Vietnam War. Okay, so just put Vietnam there. You don't have to write down any of this other. So Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were called French Indochina, and they had been under French control. So the Vietnamese fight a war to basically get their independence from the French. And the leader, his name was Ho Chi Minh. And he was a communist. So America didn't like that he was a communist, of course, right? Because we're trying to contain communism. So John F. Kennedy supported a guy in South Vietnam because he was also a Catholic like Kennedy was. And we started sending money and support to Vietnam to help the South Vietnamese because we didn't want Ho Chi Minh to take over in the north. And so we're very concerned about this because Vietnam had been divided. And so this is how America gets involved in the Vietnam War. President Eisenhower comes up with this idea of the domino theory, which is an extension of containment. Again, you're not writing anything. The only thing you had to write down was the Vietnam War in your blank. And so domino theory is that if one country falls, then all of them would fall. So if you're looking back at this map, if Vietnam falls, then boom, Laos is going to fall, then Cambodia is going to fall, then Thailand is going to fall, then Malaysia is going to fall, and so on. So the domino theory is what he came up with. So that's why we sent troops in. President Johnson is the first to put troops on the ground. And in 1968, 500,000 American soldiers were in Vietnam. This is the first time that war is really televised, and Americans are seeing it, and they're really kind of freaking out about this. And that is why part of the reason that people have such strong feelings about Vietnam. We're going to talk about Vietnam in the stations next class. Nixon comes after Johnson, and Nixon is who finally brings them home, but he doesn't do it kind of fast enough, in a lot of Americans' opinion. Vietnam was reunited as a communist country, so this is really, people argue this is the only war the American has ever lost, and we did not achieve our objective. We did not declare war on Vietnam, but we were involved in the conflict there, and we definitely did not achieve our objective. So your last blank there, it says nuclear weapons and the theory of deterrence. And deterrence is a belief that we have large amounts of nuclear war by both superpowers will prevent a nuclear attack because both sides could strike back with devastating power. So it's that idea, if I have really strong weapons, then I will deter the enemy from attacking me. Okay? So deterrence is your last blank. All right, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to watch this little Cold War video summary, and then you are going to do your Cold War map. So we will see you on Thursday. Me and Mr. Witt will be back then.